She whispered it with cracked lips. "We've been hungry for 5 days." And in that frozen silence, a stranger rode out of the storm, not with promises, not with pity, but with bread. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he meant salvation or danger. But the moment he stepped into that broken way station, the widow realized her life and her sons would never be the same. Stay with me. Because what happened next is one of the most human, heartbreaking miracles ever found on a winter road. The wind came first. A long, dragging moan rolled across the Wyoming plains, the kind that carried miles without breaking, slipping through every crack the land ever made. It rattled the old signpost outside the stage road, just a splintered pole leaning sideways. Its arrow pointing nowhere now, half buried under a skim of snow. The sky above it was the color of pewter, heavy and low, waiting to fall. Inside the abandoned way station, whatever warmth once lived there had long since left. The roof, patched with rusted tin, trembled every time the wind pushed against it. The front door hung crooked on one hinge, tapping and lifting like it wanted to escape its own frame. Snow drifted through the gaps. Dust lay on everything else. In the far corner, beside a coal stove that hadn't seen a good fire in years, Evelyn Hart sat with her back against the wall, skirts gathered tight around her legs. Her dress, black faded to charcoal, was thin at the elbows. The hem, stiff with dirt from too many miles, walked. A scarf was knotted at her throat, more thread than fabric now. Her hands, cracked from cold, were wrapped around a small, trembling body. Toby, 4 years old and light as a sack of hay, lay curled against her chest. His blanket, once wool, had been worn to something closer to gauze. His breath came shallow. Every so often he coughed those hollow, papery coughs that sounded as if air had to scrape its way out of him. Evelyn shifted to hold him closer, trying to warm him with her own bones, but she was cold too, colder than she'd ever been. The rafters creaked overhead as if the old station wanted to groan, but didn't have the strength. The wind whistled through the walls, making the stove flicker its weak orange glow. It wasn't heat, just the memory of heat, clinging to a handful of dying coals she'd nursed since dawn. She lowered her gaze to her hand. 5 fingers, 5 days. That's how long it had been since they'd eaten anything that could be called food. Yesterday she'd split the last cracker, soaked it in melted snow, and prayed Toby wouldn't ask for more. He did, of course. Children didn't understand that hunger sometimes had no answer left. Her stomach cramped again. She pressed a hand against it, as if she could steady it by will alone. Her lips burned every time she licked them, cracked enough to bleed. Yet the hunger in her chest, the fear hurt worse. They'd run so far, walked so long, and for what? To die on a forgotten road between 2 towns too small to remember their own names. She reached for the tin box at her side. She already knew it was empty, had checked it twice that morning, but habit made her look again. The lid popped open with a tired snap. No coffee, no flour, no sugar, not even crumbs. Only a single brass button from her husband's old coat, the one she kept because she didn't have anything else of him left. She touched it with her thumb. It was cold as the air around them. A gust of wind banged the warped shutters. Toby startled awake with a soft gasp, blinking up at the ceiling. The boards above him bowed inward, their nails rusted to orange tears. "Maman," he whispered. "Yes, sweetheart." Her voice was faint. She had to clear her throat before the words came out. His little hand rose, pointing vaguely upward, to nowhere. His eyes were glassy with exhaustion. "Mama, are we dying today?" The way he said it, quiet, honest, almost curious, cut her deeper than the cold ever had. Her jaw tightened. Her breath shook. She wanted to say no. Wanted to say they'd see spring. Wanted to say they'd reach a town where the sheriff wasn't paid to look the other way. Where the bank doors didn't slam in her face. Where men didn't whisper behind her back about a widow traveling alone. But her throat closed. Nothing came out. She lowered her forehead to his, breathing the same thin air. Toby blinked once, slow. He didn't cry. He was too tired for tears now. His small fingers clutched the front of her dress, the fabric worn to softness. Evelyn swallowed the knot in her throat, lifted him just enough to slip her shawl tighter around him. "Rest, baby," she murmured, hoping he wouldn't hear the tremor in her voice. "Rest while you can." Another gust hit the walls. Snow sifted across the floorboards, like white dust from a broken world. The stove hissed weakly. The shadows of the rafters stretched long and thin in the fading light, like they were reaching for the pair of them, but couldn't quite touch. Toby's eyes fluttered. He drifted back into that half-sleep children fall into when they're too hungry to stay awake. His breathing, shallow but steady, told her she had a few minutes alone with her fear. She eased him down onto a folded coat hers and pushed herself up with both hands. Her knees popped. Every joint felt carved from ice. She crossed the room with slow steps, each one a small battle, until she stood before the station's frosted window. Outside, the world was white and endless. The stage road ran like a pale scar across the plains, disappearing into a blur of snow. No wagon tracks, no riders, no life. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, her breath fogging a small circle. For a long moment she just stood there, empty, small, barely part of the world anymore. Then her lips parted. "Lord," she whispered, voice trembling, "send anybody." Snow drifted sideways across the road. Nothing moved, even a sinner. Her breath hitched, her fingers curled against the window frame. "Just," she bowed her head, "someone with bread." Her words dissolved into the wind, carried out into the frozen silence, a plea so soft the plains themselves almost didn't hear it, but something else did, far off, beyond the next rise. A faint, rhythmic thud began to tremble through the snow, slow at first, then steady, then unmistakable, hoofbeats coming their way. Evelyn lifted her head, heart knocking once hard against her ribs. The way station felt suddenly smaller, the silence thinner, the world sharper. Someone was coming. She didn't know if it meant salvation, or the very danger she'd been running from. The sound came slow at first, just a faint crunching beneath the wind. Then another, closer. Snow crust breaking under weight, leather creaking, a rhythm, steady and patient. The way only a seasoned rider keeps pace in bitter weather. Evelyn stiffened at the window. The frost on the glass blurred the world outside, but she could make out a shape breaking through the flurry, broad-shouldered, swaying with a horse's gait. A darker shadow against all that white. The hoofbeats grew louder. Toby stirred against the coat she'd folded beneath him, blinking up in confusion. She pressed a hand to his back. "Hush now," she whispered, though her own heart beat like it was trying to outrun itself. The chestnut gelding emerged fully into view, head low, breath puffing in long white ghosts. Its rider leaned forward in the saddle, a long dust-colored coat pulled tight around him, hat brim sagging beneath snow, a gray scarf wrapped from chin to collarbone, stiff with frost. His posture dipped on one side, as if favoring an old wound. He wasn't a bounty hunter by the look, or at least not a proud one. His horse was too worn, his coat too patched, and yet he didn't ride like a desperate man. He rode like someone who'd seen too much road to be frightened by its emptiness. Evelyn whispered, "Dear Lord," without knowing if she prayed for him to come nearer or turn back. The rider spotted the thin wisp of smoke curling from the station's crooked chimney. He slowed the gelding with a soft tug, boots brushing snow as he dismounted with a stiff grunt. One leg dragged slightly, an old injury. By the look, a cavalry limp. Her pulse thudded hard. Men who limped from war carried many things back with them, and hunger often wasn't the worst of them. Toby reached for her hand, fingers tiny and cold. She squeezed once, silently promising what she wasn't sure she could give. Outside, the stranger looped the reins over a bent hitch post. A faded Union cavalry canteen clinked softly at his hip. Rolled behind the saddle, half wrapped in leather, was a patched blue army coat, the kind issued years ago, during darker times. He climbed the wooden steps slowly, each board groaning under his weight. Snow fell from his hat brim as he paused at the door, hand on the latch. Evelyn's breath came tight. She grabbed the broken iron poker from beside the stove, stepping in front of Toby, shielding him with her body. The latch lifted, cold air knifed in. The man filled the doorway, broad frame outlined by swirling white. When his eyes adjusted to the dim cabin light, he stopped just long enough for Evelyn to see a shadow of surprise cross his face. He took in everything: the nearly dead fire, the empty shelves, the woman with the stiff jaw and shaking hands, and the child, pale and thin as paper. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a rough edge, sanded down by miles, but not unkind. "Ma'am, name's Lucas Braddock." His voice dropped, quieter than the wind outside, but it'll fill a young belly for a spell. He unwrapped a small cloth bundle from his bag. Inside was a chunk of cold cornbread, hard around the edges, near collapsing in the middle. It wasn't enough for any grown man to ride a day on. It was barely enough for a child, yet Lucas held it in both hands, the way some men hold prayer books, almost reverent. He knelt, joints cracking, and extended it toward Toby. "Let the boy eat first," he said. "A man can wait. A child shouldn't have to." Toby looked from Lucas to his mother, eyes wide with hunger and something else, fear, hope. He didn't know the difference anymore. Evelyn felt her heart twist. She searched Lucas's face, the lines beside his eyes, the scar hiding beneath a week's worth of beard, the tired stoop in his posture. If he came to do them harm, he wouldn't have given up his gun. And he sure wouldn't be kneeling in front of a starving child. She exhaled, the breath trembling out of her, a small nod. Toby took the bread with both hands, like it was fragile, and bit into it. His eyes closed. A tiny sound escaped him, half sob, half relief, as crumbs scattered across his blanket. Lucas watched him eat, silent, the kind of silence that said he'd known that hunger, once. Evelyn's throat ached as she whispered, "Thank you." Lucas dipped his head. "Don't thank me yet." For a moment, only Toby's small chewing filled the room. The wind outside pushed at the shutters again, making the cabin shiver. Then Evelyn spoke, voice raw as gravel sliding. "We ain't eaten proper in 5 days." Lucas's jaw tightened. His gaze swept the room, the shutter rattling in its frame, the stove nearly dead, the shelves barren as a dry well. He took in every detail, weighing what it meant. He stood slowly, brushed dust from his knees, and looked at her with a calm that didn't waver. Then you don't stay here another night. The wind pressed hard against the walls, as if trying to listen for her answer. Evelyn swallowed, feeling the world shift under her feet. Somewhere in that moment, between hunger and hope, between fear and the stranger kneeling on her floor, she realized nothing about the road ahead would ever be the same. The wind had begun to howl harder, rolling in from the north like a pack of wolves, gathering their breath. Snow thrashed against the crooked walls of the way station, slipping through every gap and seam. The coal stove hissed low, fighting a battle it had already lost. Evelyn pulled Toby closer, watching Lucas Braddock study the room with eyes that missed nothing. He wasn't a man who filled silence with chatter. He let it settle around them, as natural to him as breathing. When he finally spoke, it wasn't grand or heavy, just plain truth, delivered the way a man ties a knot, simple, sure, unadorned. "My place is 7 miles west," he said, tugging on his gloves, "out near a creek that don't always run, and a line of cottonwoods that somehow still stand. 7 miles, in deeper snow than this." Evelyn felt her stomach twist. Lucas must have seen the fear cross her eyes, because he added quietly, "A long 7, I know, but the land's flat, and my gelding's steady." He stepped away from the wall, giving her enough space to breathe. Snow clung to his coat, melting in slow beads. His breath fogged the cold air. "I ain't offering more than I got," he said. "No fine rooms, no feather beds, just a dry roof, a tired stove, and a barn that don't leak." His gaze drifted to Toby, who was licking crumbs from his fingers. "But I can promise you this, that boy won't sleep hungry tonight." Toby looked up at the word boy, crumbs on his lips, cheeks flushed with the first warmth he'd felt in days. His eyes sparkled when he heard horses. Though he said nothing, just gripped Evelyn's skirt tighter. Evelyn's heart clenched. She wanted to trust this man. God help her. She wanted to, but every mile of the road behind her reminded her what trust could cost. She saw again the banker's office in Kansas, the thick velvet curtains drawn tight. Jonas Fletcher sitting behind a polished desk. Ink-stained fingers steepled beneath his chin. His smile had been gentle, but his eyes sharp and cold. Calculating had wandered toward Toby's birth papers. "Sign here. Evie," he'd said. "A woman alone can't manage land. Let me protect what's best for the boy." Protect. The word tasted like iron in her mouth. Then there were the men outside the saloon, leaning against door frames, with nothing to do but watch her pass. Their boots crossed, their hands too eager to tip their hats, their offers of help carrying meanings she pretended not to understand. Every road she took, every town she passed, someone tried to claim a piece of her in exchange for mercy. And standing in the middle of all that memory was her husband's grave. A small wooden cross on a windswept Kansas hill, no flowers, no visitors, no one left to speak his name but her. Evelyn blinked hard, pushing the ache away. She was so tired of running that her bones felt hollow. And yet, was it safer to follow a stranger or to stay here, where the cold crept deeper, promising a gentler death than men ever could? Another gust slammed against the way station, sending snow through the cracks. A wet drip fell from the ceiling, splashing onto the floorboards. The stove's last ember gave a weak sigh. Lucas watched all of it, not judging, just seeing. "You already know the answer," he said, as if reading her mind. "Storm will get worse. Your fire's dying. Roads won't stay open long." She hugged Toby close. His small hand reached for her neck, trusting her without question. That trust broke something inside her. Her breath trembled. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady from hunger and fear. She wrapped the shawl tighter around Toby, feeling his ribs through the thin fabric. Her fingers stroked his hair once, gently. Then she turned to Lucas. He didn't move, didn't press her, just waited. "All right, Mr. Braddock," she whispered, barely above the wind. "We'll ride. If you swear by whatever you still believe in, you won't hurt us." He didn't blink, didn't flinch. "I don't swear easy." "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "but I'll stake my name on this you and the boy are safe under it." His name, spoken like a promise, not a claim. Evelyn felt a small shiver run through her that had nothing to do with cold. She pulled Toby into her arms, kissed the top of his head, and exhaled the fear she'd carried since the day they fled Kansas. "Then we trust your name," she said. Lucas nodded, the kind of slow nod a man gives when accepting a responsibility he already decided to carry. He pushed the door open. The wind burst in, wild and cold, snow spiraling around them in frantic dance. Lucas lifted Toby gently, settling him on the saddle in front of him. Toby clung to the saddle horn, looking both terrified and thrilled. Evelyn couldn't help the small ache in her chest. Children found wonder, even in storms. Lucas walked her to the pack mule tied beside the gelding. "She's steady," he said. "Got more sense than most folks." Evelyn placed her hand on the mule's rough mane. The warmth beneath her palm steadied her. The way station loomed behind them, tilted, broken, dying. The place where she'd heard her son ask if they were dying. The place she never wanted to see again. Lucas swung onto his gelding with a grunt of effort, legs stiff from old war pain. He adjusted Toby, keeping the child tucked against his coat. "Ready?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, not brave, just finished with fear. They set out into the wind, hooves crunching across the frozen earth. Snow swirled around them, swallowing the world. Evelyn tightened her grip on the mule's reins, heart hammering as the way station faded behind them. She didn't look back, not once. But Lucas did, only for a breath. Watching the broken shack shrink to a speck in the storm, he let the wind tear the quiet words from his mouth. No one should die on a road like that. The storm swallowed his whisper, the plains swallowed the road, and somewhere ahead, hidden in 7 long miles of winter, waited whatever fate would come next. Dusk came down slow across the Wyoming plain, laying a violet hush over the snow as Lucas Braddock led them through the final stretch of frozen earth. The cottonwoods he spoke of stood in a ragged line, bare branches rattling like old bones against the wind. Beyond them, half sheltered by a rise in the ground, sat his ranch. Ranch was a generous word. The log cabin looked modest, even by frontier standards. Single-roomed. Roof pitched low. Logs darkened by years of storms. Smoke drifted thinly from the stone chimney, curling into the purple sky. Off to the right leaned a small blacksmith shed, little more than a slanted roof and rough beams around a soot-streaked anvil. Behind the cabin stood a corral with 3 scruffy cows huddled close to the fence, and Lucas's chestnut gelding, head low and patient as ever. It wasn't much, but to Evelyn, after 7 miles of snow and fear, it looked like a lifeline hammered into the earth. Lucas swung down stiffly, favoring his bad leg. Toby, warm inside Lucas's coat, blinked at the sight of the place with a look that was dangerously close to wonder. "This is it," Lucas said. "Braddock Ranch. Ain't big, ain't fancy, but it stood through worse winters than this one." He lifted Toby down, careful, steady, almost gentle, for a man built like a barn door. "I'll put on beans," he murmured, reaching for a dented pot. "Got some coffee left, too. Not the good kind." He filled the pot from a bucket of half-frozen water, added beans, and set it on the stove's edge. His movements were practiced. Soldiers' habits turned ranch chores measured, economical, quiet. He placed a tin plate in front of Toby first. Evelyn stepped forward. "Mr. Braddock, he doesn't need to eat before you. You've been riding in this cold longer than." Lucas shook his head. "Not unkindly, ma'am. Folks who've been walking as long as you two have," he said softly, "don't belong waiting behind me. And that boy sure don't." The firmness in his voice silenced her better than harshness ever could. Toby ate slowly at first, then faster, the sound of his spoon scraping the tin plate almost musical in its persistence. Evelyn's eyes glistened despite herself. When the pot was nearly empty and the room smelled of coffee strong enough to chase away ghosts, Lucas glanced at the bed. "You and the boy take that," he said. Evelyn's head snapped up. "No. I can sleep on the floor. You shouldn't give up your bed." He shrugged. "I ain't giving it up. I'm just choosing the barn." "The barn," she whispered. "Best sleep I ever got was next to a horse," Lucas said casually, grabbing a blanket roll from under the bed. "Won't break me now." He slung the blanket over his shoulder, grabbed a lantern, and moved toward the door. Snow hissed against the window as the wind began to rise again. He pulled the door open, but before he could step out, Evelyn's voice broke softly across the small room. "Mr. Braddock." Why, he paused on the threshold. The lantern's glow cast half his face in gold, the other half in shadow. Snow swirled behind him like drifting ash. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he looked at her steady, quiet. But something raw flickered behind that steadiness. "Because somebody should have done it for my ma." His voice dropped to a low rumble. "And didn't." The wind carried the rest of the cold in. Lucas stepped out into it, the door closing behind him with a gentle thud that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Evelyn stood motionless. Toby yawned, leaning into the warmth of the stove. But that line, those few soft, unguarded words, hung in the air like a lantern's glow refusing to fade. Dawn crept in, slow, pale light filtering through the frost-rimmed window. The storm had quieted sometime in the night, leaving the world outside blanketed in white stillness. Inside the cabin, the air felt warmer than it had any right to be. Evelyn woke to an unfamiliar smell bacon. Not much of it, but enough that the scent curled through the room like a memory of better winters. She pushed herself upright, the wool blanket sliding from her shoulders. Her breath fogged slightly in the cool air, but not like before. The cold no longer bit. It only murmured. A soft shape by the stove caught her eye. Toby? He was bundled in Lucas Braddock's spare coat far too big for him, sleeves dangling, collar swallowing half his face. He slept curled near the stove as if he'd always belonged there, cheeks flushed warm. She hadn't placed him there. She knew that, without needing to think. Toby must have grown cold in the night. And Lucas, well, Lucas had simply done what needed doing, quietly as always. The stove crackled, coffee boiled in a dented pot. A few scraps of bacon sizzled on a small iron pan. Evelyn rose, gathering her shawl tight, and let her eyes drift around the cabin in the gentle morning hush. She hadn't dared look too closely last night, tired, overwhelmed, unsure whether this place was sanctuary or another trap waiting to spring. Now, in the calm of morning, she let herself see. Near the bunk, on a small wooden crate, lay a box, left half open. Inside, she glimpsed 2 war medals, dulled with time, but carefully wrapped in cloth. Next to them, Tucked between old letters and folded ribbon sat a faded photograph of two young men in blue uniforms. One was unmistakably Lucas, younger, jaw clean of beard, eyes firm and bright. The other man stood with an arm slung over Lucas's shoulder, grinning with the kind of ease the frontier didn't allow anymore. A brother, a friend, someone he'd left behind somewhere between battlefields. She closed the lid gently. By the window sat a lone rocking chair, facing outward toward the cottonwoods and the pale morning sky. Dust clung to the arms. It hadn't been used in a while. A man living alone didn't sit and rock much, not unless he was thinking on someone lost. "Toby?" she whispered. He stirred, rubbed his eyes, and held up one small hand. "Mama." It got a tear. His voice was thin with sleep. He showed her his tiny knit glove, the left one thumb ripped down the seam. It was Papa's last winter. Evelyn's breath caught. She knelt, touching the little glove. With a tenderness she fought to steady. "We'll fix it," she promised. Though she wasn't sure with what thread or time or strength, Toby nodded, trusting her because little boys didn't know how not to. Later, after bacon scraps were gone and the last crumbs of hard bread divided, Evelyn washed their tin dishes in a basin half filled with melted snow. The water stung her hands, but she welcomed the sting. It meant she was still alive. Behind her, she heard muttering. Lucas sat at the table, bent slightly forward, big hands holding a needle and coarse thread, like they were strange tools from another world. He squinted, pricked his finger, cursed under his breath, then tried again. His fingertips were rough, cracked from cold and rope and years of ranch work. They were not made for sewing. But he kept going. Slow, stubborn, quiet. Evelyn didn't say a word. She just watched him from the corner of her eye, unable to look away from the simple, earnest focus in his brow. When Toby wandered outside later to chase sunbeams and inspect the cows, Lucas kept at the stitching. He didn't speak of it, didn't ask for thanks, didn't even show he was doing it for them. It was a gesture meant to be unseen, the kind men like him didn't talk about, the kind that mattered most. Night brought a soft, gray calm. The wind had settled, leaving the cabin wrapped in an almost tender hush. Toby fell asleep quickly, his breath even, his small hand curled near his cheek. Evelyn tucked him in beside the stove, layering Lucas's coat over him once more. As she turned to straighten the table, she saw it, the glove, folded neatly beside Toby's makeshift pillow, stitched crooked, stitched uneven, stitched strong. Her breath caught sharp, helpless. The little tear was gone, replaced with thread pulled tight by hands that didn't know how to sew, but tried anyway. Evelyn picked up the glove, thumb brushing the clumsy seam. Something inside her softened slow, painful, like thawing after long cold. Her eyes burned. She pressed the glove to her chest, held it there, letting the warmth of it seep into her ribs. In that quiet, she understood something simple and deep. Kindness didn't always arrive like a rescue. Sometimes it came like this quiet, hands mending a child's glove in a half-lit cabin. The next morning, Lucas stepped in from the barn, smelling of hay and cold dawn. He stamped snow from his boots, shook frost from his hat. Evelyn stood by the table, the glove in one hand. "Mr. Braddock," she said softly. He looked up, brow lifting a man, unused to being addressed gently. "You stitched more than a glove," she whispered. Lucas swallowed once, jaw tightening a fraction. Then he shrugged, uncomfortable, as if kindness didn't sit right on his shoulders. "Kid needs his hands warm," he muttered. That's all. But she saw the truth flicker in his eyes before he looked away, and she knew that wasn't all. Not by a long stretch. The silence between them settled warm, and for the first time in months, Evelyn didn't fear the quiet. The wind rose again that evening, shaking the cabin as if the planes meant to test how well the logs were joined. Snow scraped against the window like a restless hand. Out near the blacksmith lean-to, Lucas Braddock stood before the forge, coaxing life into the embers with slow, measured breaths. Sparks lifted into the cold air, bright as fireflies, before they died. He held a bent door hinge with thick leather gloves, watching it glow red in the heart of the flame. The heat stung his cheeks. The night stung the rest of him. Inside the cabin, lamplight flickered low. Evelyn sat at the table, needle in hand, mending the frayed hem of her dress. She worked carefully, methodically, every stitch a quiet act of survival. She hummed under her breath, the tune so faint it was almost more memory than sound. Toby lay on the floor near the stove, making tiny clip-clop noises with a wooden horse Lucas had carved from scrap that afternoon. The lines were rough, but the child loved it as if it were made of ivory. Lucas smiled at the sound, the simple joy of it. He lifted the hammer, tapping the hinge just enough to straighten the curve. The anvil rang sharp, echoing across the darkening yard. Then he paused. The cold pricked his ears. Toby was talking. "Can't say his name," the boy whispered to the wooden horse. "Mama says if we say his name, he'll find us. The bad man from the bank." Lucas froze. The heat of the forge warmed one side of him, but a colder heat fear, anger, something he hadn't felt in years, crawled up the other side. He set the hinge down slowly. Sparks flared at his feet. The bad man from the bank, a name that lived in the boy's throat like a splinter. He stood there a long moment, letting the words settle the way snow settles after a storm. The wind tugged at his coat. The forge hissed softly. Inside, Toby moved on, lost again in play. Children could do that. Lucas could not. When he finally walked back to the cabin, he stopped at the door, breath clouding the air. He watched Evelyn without entering. She sat at the table, needle moving in and out of fabric, shoulders drawn tight against the cold. The lamplight carved soft shadows across her face. He stepped inside without a word. Later, when Toby fell asleep, wrapped in Lucas's spare blanket, Evelyn drifted toward the window. Snow drifted sideways across the yard, catching the moonlight in slow spirals. She stood there, with her arms crossed, hands tucked beneath her elbows, body a silhouette, carved from worry. Lucas sat at the table, rifle laid open in front of him. He wasn't cleaning it out of need, just habit. Habit helped a man think. The silence stretched long enough to feel heavy. Finally, he spoke. The boy mentioned a bank, he said quietly, and a bad man. Evelyn didn't turn. Lucas set the rifle down and folded his hands. "You don't owe me your story, ma'am, but I can't help you fight what I don't see coming." The wind pushed harder at the walls. She let out a long breath, fogging the glass. When she turned around, her eyes were distant, haunted not by ghosts, but by the living. "It started after Matthew died," she murmured. "My husband, he worked the mill outside Brighton, Kansas. A wheel chain snapped. Took him before I even reached the doctor." Lucas nodded once. He knew the kind of accidents that didn't leave room for last words. Matthew's brother, Jonas Fletcher, he handled the money in town, a man folks trusted. Her voice tightened. Too much, maybe. She moved back to the table, holding the chairs back for support. Matthew left Toby a small patch of land. Good soil, just enough to build on someday. Jonas said I should sign guardianship papers so he could manage things proper. She scoffed softly, bitterness cutting the word. I refused. Lucas didn't interrupt. Then the smiles stopped. She whispered. He showed up at my door with papers and threats. Said no court west of the river would side with a penniless widow over a man with ledgers, lawmen, and a badge sitting on his desk. Her hands trembled as she set them on the table. One night, he pounded on the door, drunk, said Toby needed a real man's guidance, said he'd take him, whether I signed or not. Lucas's jaw tightened so hard it creaked. I left before dawn, Evelyn said, Toby on my hip. We walked past the saloon, with the lanterns still burning, past the sheriff's office. Couldn't go there. Sheriff plays cards with Jonas every Friday. Ain't no safety there. She swallowed hard. We followed the stage road, as far as legs would take us. Lucas leaned back, breath deep. He stared at his hands, scarred and rough from years of war and ranch work, and wondered how anyone could look at a woman and child and see opportunity instead of souls. Well, he said finally, voice low, steady, carrying something sturdy beneath it. This ain't his desk. Evelyn exhaled shakily. And this ain't his land. The lamp flickered. Toby made a soft sound in his sleep. The wind scraped snow against the cabin walls, like the planes whispering their approval or their warning. Lucas reached for the rifle again, not to clean, not to think, but because some truths demanded readiness. And Evelyn stood there, watching him, knowing a line had been crossed, not between them, but between past and present, between fear and the first flicker of safety. Winter eased its grip by inches, not mercy. The storms didn't vanish, they only paused to catch their breath. Between those pauses, life at Braddock Ranch began stitching itself together in the smallest, quietest ways. Lucas started most mornings in the corral, brushing frost from the gelding's mane. He wasn't much of a talker, but Toby didn't seem to mind. The boy followed him everywhere now, his little boots crunching through thin layers of snow. That's it, Lucas murmured one morning, guiding Toby's hand along the gelding's neck. Flat palm, let him feel your steady. Toby nodded solemnly, tongue poking out in concentration. The gelding huffed warm breath against his sleeve, and Toby giggled a sound Evelyn hadn't heard in too long. A sound that made her shoulders ease without her realizing it. Inside the cabin, Evelyn put beans to simmer on the stove, salt pork sizzled in a cracked skillet. She hesitated before pulling down a dust-covered can from the top-shelf peaches. Tucked away like a secret, Lucas stepped in, stamping snow from his boots. Was saving those, he said, voice unreadable. Evelyn lowered the can. Then I shouldn't. He shook his head. Meant savin' for someone. Didn't know who. Till now. She felt warmth rise in her chest, sharp as the cold outside, but far gentler. At the table later, she pressed pencil to paper, brow furrowed as she combed through Lucas's ranch accounts. Numbers were a comfort, they obeyed rules the world didn't. Lucas leaned on one elbow, listening as she pointed with the pencil's worn tip. This broker here shorted you 3 pounds per head last delivery. Lucas frowned. Thought something felt off. She tapped the ledger. He's banking on you being too tired or too busy to notice. Lucas huffed a small sound that almost passed for a laugh. You're better at this than half the clerks I knew back in town. Evelyn didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth lifted slow, shy. Days passed like that, quiet tasks, shared without saying they were shared. Then came Sunday. Lucas rose early, hitching the wagon with careful, practiced hands. The air was crisp, pale sun glinting off the snow. Evelyn wrapped Toby in a thick scarf, adjusting it twice before climbing up beside Lucas on the wooden seat. "Dry Creek's small," he said as they rode. "Folk mind their own, most days." The town appeared like a collection of stubborn thoughts against the horizon, a blacksmith shop with smoke rising straight up, a general store with a faded sign, a low-roofed saloon, and a whitewashed chapel standing slightly crooked, as if it had settled into the earth over time. Curious eyes followed them. Hands paused on porch rails. A woman at the store window tilted her head, whispering to someone behind her. But Lucas kept his back straight, shoulders squared beneath his coat. "Mrs. Hart and her boy," he said to anyone whose eyes lingered too long, "staying through the winter. No explanations. No room for speculation. In the chapel." They took the back pew. Toby sat between them, feet not touching the floor. Evelyn kept her hands folded tightly, knuckles pale. The aging preacher lifted his voice in a wavering but earnest tone. "Refuge in the wilderness," he said. "A place for the weary. A shelter for those who have fled with fear at their heels." Evelyn's hands trembled. She stared at the hymnal as though the words might swallow her. Lucas noticed. Without looking at her, he shifted closer, just enough so the side of his hand steadied the hymnal she couldn't hold still. She didn't speak, didn't thank him, but her breath steadied, outside, after service. The townsfolk nodded politely, most keeping a respectful distance. A few asked after Toby, charmed by the boy's shy smile. Evelyn felt the prickle of fear along her spine. But Lucas's presence beside her, tall, steady, unmistakably sure of who he stood with, anchored her. On the wagon ride home, Toby sat in the middle, bouncing slightly with each rut in the road. The sun had dipped low, casting orange glints across the snow. His head began to bob, then gently, it settled against Lucas's arm. Lucas froze for a moment, as though unsure of the rules for a child's trust. Then he relaxed the arm just enough to steady the boy's weight. Evelyn watched them, something warm and fragile blooming in her chest, something she didn't dare touch. Afraid it would fall apart. The wheels rumbled, the horses snorted, snow cracked under the iron-rimmed wheels. In that fading light, she whispered, voice barely more than wind for a minute there. It almost felt like we'd never been hungry. Lucas didn't turn, didn't speak, but he didn't move his arm away. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking not with cold, but with something she hadn't let herself feel in a long, long while. A feeling dangerously close to home. The wagon rolled on toward the cabin, toward the fragile peace they were building together, a peace that trembled like thin ice, beautiful and breakable. And somewhere behind them, far beyond sight but not beyond reach, the past stirred. By early February, the plains had settled into a brittle kind of quiet, the kind that wasn't peace so much as a long breath, held too long. Frost clung to the cottonwoods in thick, white veins. The creek, little more than a ribbon of frozen glass, wound its way past the ranch with a soft groan beneath the ice. Lucas saddled the gelding at first light. "Fence lines will be drifted again," he said, tightening the cinch. "Better check 'em before the cows go wandering." Evelyn nodded. Toby perched on her hip, still half asleep. She watched Lucas ride out through the thinning mist, his silhouette swallowed by the pale morning. She didn't know why the sight of him leaving tugged at her nerves. Today maybe the way the wind carried a strange stillness, maybe the night's unease still clinging to her bones. Lucas followed the fence north, through drifts, up to the gelding's knees. The sun rose slow and cold, glowing dull behind a bank of clouds. At the far edge of his property, near the creek bend, he swung down, testing the lower rail of the fence. It held. He was about to mount again when something caught his eye prints. Boot prints. Fresh. Too fresh. Lucas knelt. The prints cut deep into the snow, heel sharp, toe pointed like a man used to fast walking, not the shuffling, wide stance of a ranch hand or trapper. This stride was long, deliberate, confident, someone searching, not wandering. He followed the prints a short distance until they ended near a cottonwood. There, half buried in frost, lay a cigar stub, the kind rolled tight with imported leaf, dark as molasses. Fancy? Not local. Not cheap. Beside it, tucked under a rock as if dropped by accident or wind, was the torn corner of a printed handbill. Lucas lifted it carefully. The ink was smudged, but two words still cut through the whiteness: reward and widow with child. A slow cold crept through him that had nothing to do with winter. His war-trained senses surged awake, the ones he'd tried to bury under years of ranch chores and quiet evenings. The same instincts that once saved him along a creek in Tennessee now thrummed like a drumbeat beneath his ribs. He stood still, listening. The plains were silent, too silent. A man could be watching from the tree line. A man could be close enough to hear his breath. Lucas slid the paper inside his coat and mounted the gelding in one smooth motion, ignoring the stab of pain through his bad leg. He didn't ride fast, drew eyes. He rode steady, the way a careful man did when he knew he wasn't alone. Back at the ranch, he stabled the gelding quietly, wiped the snow from his coat, and stepped inside the cabin as if nothing were wrong. But his eyes were different, harder, sharper, measuring the shadows. That night, the wind came back, rattling the shutters like a warning. Evelyn tucked Toby beneath two quilts, humming a lullaby that trembled around the edges. Lucas sat at the table with a map unrolled in front of him, jaw set, marking points and distances with a pencil worn to a stub. He didn't speak, not yet. Outside, the sky darkened to ink, the fire crackled low. Evelyn finished folding the last of the laundry when a sudden, sharp cry tore through the cabin. "Mama, Mama!" Toby shot upright in the bedroll, eyes wild, tears instantly streaming. "He found us. Mama, he's at the window, I saw him." Evelyn dropped the shirt in her hands and rushed to him, pulling him against her chest. "Shh, shh, sweetheart. It's a dream. Just a dream." But her eyes flicked instinctively toward the black window pane. Lucas was already standing, the map forgotten. He moved to the window in 3 strides, rifle in hand, scanning the dark outside with a soldier's stillness. Nothing moved, but the boy's terror hung thick in the room. Toby sobbed into Evelyn's shoulder, whispering, "Don't say his name, Mama. Don't say it." She rocked him, but her own breath shook. Lucas let the curtain fall back into place. He walked to the table, rolled the map tight, and tapped it once with his knuckles. "Fort Bridger's 3 days' ride east," he said quietly, voice controlled. "Cavalry garrison there. Judge Hardin comes through Dry Creek first week of each month, and the nearest territorial court's in Cheyenne." Evelyn blinked, startled by the sudden barrage of information. Lucas met her eyes. "I found tracks," he said. "Not mine." She paled. He set the torn paper on the table. She stared at it, breath trembling, hand lifting to her mouth. "Reward," she whispered. "Widow with child." Lucas nodded. Cigar brand was imported. "Don't sell those in Dry Creek. Whoever he is, he's got money enough to travel long and far chasing something that ain't his. Her knees weakened. She sank slowly into a chair. Lucas rested his palms on the table, leaning forward slightly, voice quiet but unyielding. He's close. Evelyn, or someone he hired, is. His eyes didn't soften. We're out of time for hoping he'll forget you exist. Evelyn's breath hitched. If we run again, he'll just follow. Maybe, Lucas said, and maybe he won't expect you to stay put for once. She looked toward Toby, now curled against her side, hiccuping with the last of his tears. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her hand trembling. This is the only place he's slept without waking screaming, she whispered. The only place he's laughed. Lucas straightened. And the only place he'll be safe, he said simply. His certainty steadied something inside her, but also frightened her, because she knew what it meant. Staying would not be peaceful. Staying meant they were done hiding. Staying meant the past would find them here, at this very doorstep. Her fingers tightened around Toby's small hand. The cabin felt smaller, the walls thinner, the wind outside sharper. Evelyn looked at Lucas with a mixture of fear and something else, something fragile, something growing, something that scared her almost as much as Jonas Fletcher did. Then what do we do? She whispered. Lucas didn't answer. Not yet, but the look in his eyes said he had already decided, and whatever that decision was, it would change everything. The road to Braddock Ranch was usually just a pale scar across the frozen earth, quiet, empty, forgotten by most. But that morning, Evelyn felt something in the air shift. Toby sensed it too. He pressed closer to her side, eyes wide toward the horizon. A faint brown smudge rose in the distance. Dust. Snow churned by hooves. Lucas stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on his coat. He paused mid-stride, squinting into the morning glare. 3 riders, saddles too clean, coats too fine for frontier winters. Evelyn's breath grew thin. Lucas's jaw set. As the riders approached, the shapes took form. A man in a dark wool overcoat, polished boots shining even under the gray sky. A sheriff's deputy from Kansas badge, gleaming, expression stiff, a hired gun riding loose in the saddle, chewing a toothpick as if he'd come for sport. Jonas Fletcher. He pulled his horse to a stop, like he expected applause. Snow swirled around his boots as he dismounted. Movement smooth, rehearsed the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his life. He straightened his vest, brushed dust from his sleeve, and tipped his hat in Evelyn's direction. No warmth, no grief, just ownership. Evie, he drawled, you had us all worried. Imagine my surprise to find you hiding in a stranger's shack. Evelyn tightened her hands on Toby's shoulders, pulling him behind her skirt. The boy trembled, not from cold. Jonas' smile widened, that thin banker's smile that never reached the eyes. Lucas stepped out from the porch shadows, shoulders squared, rifle resting easy in his hands. He didn't lift it. He didn't need to. Jonas's gaze flicked to him. And you must be Mr. Braddock, he said smoothly. Appreciate you watching over my family. Lucas didn't blink. Ain't your family. Is that so? Jonas reached into his coat and produced a handful of folded papers. Edges crisp. By the authority of Chase County and the laws regarding minor wards, the boy comes with me. He snapped the papers straight and held them up. Seal glinting in the weak sun. Evelyn flinched at the sight of them, those same seals used to trap people like insects under glass. Lucas took the papers, studied them calmly, line by line. Jonas waited, smirk growing. Finally, Lucas looked up, unimpressed. You crossed 200 miles on a piece of paper, signed by men who ain't never seen this land. Jonas's smile faltered. Lucas stepped forward a half pace. Out here, mister. A man's word and his neighbors count for more. The deputy shifted in his saddle, edging closer, hand inching toward his holster. The hired gun spat into the snow, grinning at Lucas with the lazy confidence of someone who'd shot for money before. Jonas sensed the shift and spread his hands in mock patience. Let's not make this ugly. Braddock, just hand over the boy. Widow's free to come home after that. Or, not. His eyes flicked toward Evelyn, cold and proprietary. Makes no difference to the paperwork. Evelyn's breath hitched. Toby whimpered. Lucas didn't move, didn't raise his rifle, didn't raise his voice. He stepped fully between Jonas and the porch, planting himself like a wall built of quiet conviction. This roof is mine, he said. The woman and the boy are under it. The wind stilled. You want them, Lucas went on, voice low but carrying. You'll have to step through me, and every ranch within 10 miles that owes me a favor. A moment hung, heavy and sharp. Then, as if the plains themselves had been waiting, 2 riders appeared at the far edge of the property line, coming at a steady pace. Then another behind them, old Samuel Keyes, whom Lucas once pulled from a snowdrift, the blacksmith, Caleb Dern, who owed Lucas $3 and a winter's worth of gratitude. Young Pete Calder, whose father Lucas helped bury last spring. They gathered without hurry, without words, forming a loose half-circle behind Lucas. Rifles unslung, but held low, frontier language. For we see you, and we will not look away. Jonas's expression shifted. Not fear, he was too proud for that, but calculation. The hired gun's grin faded. The deputy's horse sidestepped nervously. Jonas tried one last angle. The law, he snapped, will ride where bullets can't. Lucas didn't blink. And the law, he replied, ought to know when it's being used like a club. A muscle ticked in Jonas's jaw. He realized, finally, that no amount of seals or signatures could command a patch of frozen Wyoming earth where survival meant standing together or dying alone. Jonas spat into the snow at Lucas's boots. This isn't finished. Braddock, he hissed. He swung onto his horse, motioned to his men, and turned down the road. Snow burst beneath the hooves as they rode off, a wash of dust and frost trailing behind them a promise, a threat, a storm waiting to return. Evelyn sagged against the porch railing, breath shaking. Toby buried his face in her skirt, trembling. Lucas didn't watch Jonas ride away. He watched the horizon behind him, the place trouble always circled back from. The ranchers tipped their hats one by one. You holler if he comes back, old Samuel said. We ain't far. Lucas nodded. Quiet gratitude in the gesture. When the last rider disappeared into the cold, Evelyn lifted her eyes to Lucas' fear, relief, and something deeper, flickering all at once. Is it over? She whispered. Lucas looked toward the road Jonas had taken. No, he said softly. Not yet. The wind stirred the snow at their feet, carrying the lingering echo of hoofbeats into the gathering dusk. Something had been set in motion now, and it was riding straight for them. The dust from Jonas Fletcher's departure had long settled, but the tension he left behind clung to the air like the bitter taste of gun smoke. Even after the last echo of hoofbeats faded, Evelyn could not steady her breathing. Her hands shook as she helped Toby back inside the cabin, though the fire inside burned hot enough to warm the boards beneath their feet. Is he coming back? Mama Toby whispered. Evelyn swallowed. Not tonight. Lucas shut the door behind them, slid the heavy bar across it. The room was warm, but his face was carved in stone, the kind of quiet, Grim stillness that comes when a man weighs choices he hoped never to face. He stood in the center of the room a long moment, eyes lowered, breath slow, then, without a word, he crossed to his cot and knelt beside it. He pulled something from the shadows underneath a beat-up tin box, corners dented, top scratched from years of travel. Evelyn watched him, puzzled, arms wrapped around Toby. Lucas set the box on the table and sat heavily, as if preparing for something that cost strength to face. He lifted the lid. Inside lay the remnants of a past life. A crumpled photograph, two soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder, uniforms muddy, smiles faint but unmistakably real. One was Lucas, younger, eyes bright, jaw clean of stubble. The other Evelyn's breath caught, a folded letter, edges worn, a strip of faded Union blue, torn from a coat, and bloodstains on the corner of the photograph, brown with age. Lucas touched the strip of cloth gently, thumb brushing it like an old wound. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "there's something I ought to told you sooner." Her heartbeat climbed up her throat. "What is that picture?" Lucas didn't answer with words at first. Instead, he let memory pull him backward and spoke in a voice roughened by time. "Back east, near Cold Harbor. Mud was up to our shins. Smoke so thick you couldn't tell sunrise from dusk. We'd been pinned down half the day. Folks yellin', dyin', trying to crawl where they wouldn't be found by bullets." He paused, eyes on the table. "I was dragging wounded men back behind a wagon line. Heard someone call my name. When I turned, it was your husband, Thomas Hart." Evelyn went pale. Lucas continued, voice low. "He'd caught a round in the side. Bad one. Wasn't sure he'd make it. But he was smiling like a fool when I reached him. Said he knew I'd come." Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth. Lucas swallowed hard and went on. "I dragged him behind a log pile. Tried to stop the bleeding. He shoved something into my hand. He tapped the letter in the tin box. Said it was for you if he didn't get home." The fire popped softly. Lucas drew a shaky breath. "Then he made me swear. Swear that if he fell, I'd find you. Make sure you weren't alone. Said your name like a prayer he'd carried too long." Evelyn blinked hard, vision blurring. Why didn't you tell me?" Lucas stared down at his hands. "Because I didn't know how to walk up to a stranger and say I was the one holding her husband when he took his last breath. Didn't know how to explain I'd spent 10 years searching towns, asking around, following the papers for your name, but always too late or too lost." He rubbed a hand over his face. "And when I found you in that way station, starved, cold, holding your boy, it didn't feel like fate." He lifted his gaze to hers. "It felt like failure, like I should have gotten to you sooner." Evelyn sank onto the chair opposite him, chest tight, Toby asleep against her shoulder. She stared at the picture, Thomas smiling beside Lucas. Alive, whole, a moment frozen in time she had never seen before. "Thomas never told me about you," she whispered. Lucas nodded. "We weren't brothers in birth, but in the field. He saved my life more times than I could count. That makes a man family, least to me." Silence stretched between them, thick with grief and gratitude tangled together. Lucas opened the worn letter Thomas had written. The ink was faded, but still legible. "Evie, if this reaches you, I didn't make it home. Please don't blame Luke. I'd trust him with my life. And yours." Lucas closed the letter gently. "After Jonas left today," he said, voice firming with purpose, "I realized something. Jonas ain't just a bully. He's got the law wrapped round his hand like a rope. If you stay here without papers, without protection, He'll twist the law till it says what he wants. He uncorked an ink bottle, dipped the pen into it. So, I'm writing the territorial judge in Laramie. Ain't waitin' for trouble to choose its hour. Evelyn's brows knitted. What will you tell him? Everything, Lucas said simply. He started writing, his pen moving slow and steady. A sworn declaration. A request for emergency guardianship rights. A record of Jonas's threats. And a final line sealing a decade-old promise. When he finished, Lucas placed the pen down, but didn't meet her eyes. Evelyn reached across the table, fingertips brushing the edge of the photograph. So you didn't just help us out of pity, she said softly. Lucas exhaled a long, tired sound. No, she whispered. You've been carrying my husband's last favor on your back for 10 years. He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark, steady, stripped of every defense, started as a promise. He said quietly, somewhere along the trail, it turned into something else. He didn't say the word, but the silence that followed it was warmer than the fire, heavier than the winter wind, and it wrapped around the room like a truth that had been waiting for its moment. Evelyn's lips parted. Her breath caught. The world seemed to hold still. Outside, wind swept snow against the cabin walls, a soft, restless whisper. Inside, something unspoken, fragile, and dangerous flickered between them like a flame finally given air. Weeks passed slowly, the snow deepening and retreating in turn. Until the morning, the judge arrived in Dry Creek. His carriage was flanked by 2 soldiers, uniforms stiff and polished, their boots crunching over the hard-packed snow. The town stirred as word spread a court was riding through. Evelyn tightened Toby's scarf, smoothing his hair as they made their way to the tiny chapel. The pews had been pushed aside, the air smelling faintly of pine sap and candle wax. Townsfolk trickled in, curious and cautious, lining the walls, whispering among themselves. Every eye was fixed on the little white building, now transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Jonas Fletcher entered last, papers held crisp in one hand, polished leather gloves in the other. His overcoat was immaculate. His expression was that of a man who believed law was simply obedience with the right seal. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice oily, sliding over the boards, this child deserves proper guidance, protection, and stability, and it falls to a man of experience myself to ensure he is not led astray. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, then lifted his papers like a shield. These documents, issued and recognized by Chase County, confirm that custody must come to me. Evelyn felt Toby shift against her hip. His small fingers gripped hers tighter. She swallowed, heart thundering, as the chapel felt smaller, the air heavier. Lucas stood quietly, hat in his hands. He didn't rise to argue with noise or flourish, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried clear and steady. I found Evelyn and Toby half-starved in a way station between towns, he said, letting the words settle, no food, no safety, just snow and wind. That boy is my concern, because I promised Thomas Hart, his father, on a battlefield in the mud and blood, that I would see them safe. And I intend to keep that promise. He straightened, eyes sweeping the room, meeting the neighbors' gazes. Mr. Fletcher's guardianship isn't about care, it's about taking land, and I won't stand for a promise broken by greed. Evelyn's hands trembled, but her voice rang out when it was her turn. I woke one night to Jonas Fletcher standing by Toby's bed, she said, voice shaking, papers in hand, eyes like winter ice. He threatened me. He tried to claim my son and the land together. I fled. We've walked miles to survive. Please, Understand that I only wanted to keep my child safe." The room fell silent. Toby's soft breathing filled the pause. Then neighbors spoke, one by one. The blacksmith, tall and soot-streaked, stepped forward. "Lucas hauled my boy out of a creek last winter when he was frozen stiff. He knows how to protect children." The storekeeper followed, voice steady, pays fair, keeps his word, never missed a debt, never turned a friend down. The preacher, leaning on the pulpit, nodded. "Evelyn has been honest, hardworking, and fiercely protective of her child. The boy is safe with them, and her care cannot be questioned." Jonas Fletcher's face hardened, a mask of authority cracking ever so slightly under the collective weight of community witness. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, but the soldiers at the doorway, rifles unslung yet present, and the murmuring townsfolk kept him in check. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, leaned forward from the front of the chapel. The room held its collective breath. "Mr. Fletcher," he said slowly, voice carrying over the room, "the claim of guardianship is denied. Evelyn Hart is free to choose who may assist her in raising her son. And based upon testimony and the declaration left by the boy's father, Thomas Hart, Mr. Lucas Braddock is recognized as legal guardian and protector under territorial law." A whisper rose in the chapel, disbelief, relief, and gratitude tangled together. Evelyn's hand found Lucas's, clutching it as though afraid to let go. Toby's eyes widened, uncertain, then brightened as he realized the weight of the words spoken. Jonas's lips pressed thin. He fumed silently, fury burning behind polished eyes. But the two soldiers at the door remained watchful, their presence a quiet threat. He had no allies here, not today. Finally. He turned, his boots crunching in the snow as he mounted his horse and rode out, leaving a plume of dust and frost in his wake. Lucas exhaled slowly, shoulders loosening. He glanced at Evelyn and Toby. Relief softened his features, though his gaze still carried the steady caution of a man who knew the past never fully releases its grip. Evelyn's eyes glimmered with tears she did not bother to hide. She pressed Toby close, whispering, "We're safe, at last." The judge gathered his papers, soldiers flanking him, and moved toward the door. Townsfolk began to murmur congratulations quietly among themselves. The chapel, once a place of prayer, had become a fortress of justice, witness to the triumph of promise and protection over greed and threat. Outside, snow sparkled under the afternoon sun, and for the first time in weeks, the wind seemed almost gentle. Lucas helped Toby down from his arms, brushing the child's coat, while Evelyn exhaled a long, shivering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They had endured. They had survived. They had won. And beneath the Braddock roof, a fragile kind of peace finally settled in enough to warm the hearth, enough to let the heart rest, even if only for a moment. Spring arrived slowly, like a shy visitor. Snow softened into muddy ruts along the wagon tracks. The cottonwoods budded with pale green leaves, and the first warmth touched the Braddock homestead. The wind was gentler now, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and new grass across the plains. The world outside seemed to breathe again, and inside the cabin, life had begun to settle into a rhythm as steady as the stove's glow. Evelyn knelt beside Toby, primer in hand, the boy sitting cross-legged on a folded quilt near the stove. The pages were small and worn, but Lucas had bought the primer from Dry Creek's general store with careful, proud deliberation. Toby sounded, each letter, a small triumph. His eyes shone pride softening the lingering shadows beneath them. Home, safe, family. He pointed at the words, then looked up at Evelyn with a grin that spread across his whole face. Evelyn smiled back, breath-catching. For so long, words had been scarce, replaced by hunger, fear, and flight. Now they were learning the ones that mattered most. She pressed a kiss to his temple, letting the warmth sink into her, letting herself finally believe they could stay here. Outside, Lucas worked silently, sun glinting off the snow-melted ground. He sanded a wide plank until it was smooth, carving letters carefully with a knife he held steady despite calloused hands. Each stroke measured, deliberate, a mark of permanence after months of impermanence. That evening, he called them to the gate. Evelyn's heart lifted even before she saw what he had done. Hanging from new iron chains was a simple wooden sign, Braddock Homestead, Hart Family. The letters were painted dark, bold strokes on the pale wood, blending the names together. It was not erasure, it was merging. A new story, written across the entrance to their little world. Inside the cabin, supper was set out on the rough-hewn table, fresh bread, beans from the pot, and the last of the preserved peaches. The simple meal smelled of home and warmth. Toby reached eagerly for a piece of bread, chewing slowly, savoring every bite. Lucas cleared his throat, voice low, steady. "Evie, I ain't good with speeches," he began. He gestured to the table, the stove, the small room around them. "I can mend fences, shoe a horse, and keep that boy's plate from being empty. I can't promise riches, just my back, my hands, and my name. If you want it." Evelyn felt a tremor in her chest. Her hands hovered over his, trembling at the weight of the offer, not charity, not obligation, but a choice freely made. She placed her hand atop his, her fingers finding warmth in his rough, work-worn skin. "You gave us bread when all we had was hunger," she said softly, voice catching. "You gave us shelter when all we had was road. If you're offering your name, I'll wear it. Not as a mercy, as a choice." Toby, tucked in near the stove, half asleep, muttered in a voice thick with drowsiness, "Night, Papa." This time, no one corrected him. No one needed to. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, throwing gentle light across the three faces, Evelyn's calm but proud, Toby's peaceful, Lucas's steady and protective, and above it all, the wooden sign swung gently on its chains, a simple statement, but one heavy with meaning, hope, and the quiet joy of a family finally made whole. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in a small cabin, in the quiet of snow-melted mornings, in the unspoken kindness of a man who keeps a promise made on a battlefield long ago. Evelyn and Toby's journey reminds us that safety and love are not always found in grand gestures, but in the steady, patient acts that meet a heart's deepest need. A loaf of bread, a mended glove, a hand extended without question. These are the moments that rebuild trust, stitch together broken lives, and quietly declare that even in the harshest winters, warmth can return. And sometimes, the true measure of courage is not in facing a storm, but in choosing to stay when fear whispers to run again, to offer yourself, your name, your hands, and your back to another, simply because it is the right thing to do. Life may leave us scarred, hungry, and weary, but it also leaves room for hope, for community, and for the small, steadfast lights of human kindness. In the quiet, after the storm, we discover that home is not just a place. It is the care, protection, and love we choose to give one another, day by day. Thank you for being here with us. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul, stories of courage, kindness, and the quiet strength of the human heart. Your support keeps the flame alive, so we can continue sharing moments that remind us of hope, home, and the power of simple, steadfast love. From all of us at Wild West Echoes, thank you for walking these paths with us, one story at a time,